Am I live? Okay. Let's see, a quick warm for myself. Amidst the mist of cold, frosty thrusts his fist against the post and still insists he sees the ghosts. Okay. Yes, I start every single talk with a vocal warm-up to keep myself ready for this. Hello everybody. So I'm also going to be talking about platforms. So platform is one of the hot topics of the past 2 years. But mine is taking a little different angle at it. So I call it converging on platforms. So first off, a few things about me. So I live in Munich. So I've lived here for 12 years, 2013 when I moved here. So I'm Chinese American. I've been in tech for almost 20 years. I'm the head of platform at NMAC. We're an energy trade marketplace, the largest one in Europe. So basically enabling suppliers and traders to buy and sell different energy commodities. We're sort of pushing towards a green future, making it easier to buy and sell, particularly with things like solar and wind energy. So we're going to jump back to about the 80s. So I'm assuming a lot of people here have been in tech for 15, 20 years or longer. So this probably seems a bit familiar to you. So as a result, you're probably going to share some of my trauma and how organizations keep changing it over and over again. So if we think actually to basically how we had waterfall, generally, around the time you had different teams with very specific roles. So you had your product owner, you had your data center. As a result, you had your person who actually managed all the hardware there, database administrator, you had your developers, you had your QA teams and UX. And they did everything through waterfall. So highly rigid, very set timelines. They talk to the customers to kind of figure out what the requirements are, and they hand it over for basic QA to do validation, for product owner to kind of work through it, figure out what's right. They develop it, they deploy it, and by the time it gets to the user, they're a bit confused about what they got. Because during those 3 to 6 months, industry's changed, market conditions have shifted, the customer no longer needs it, so by the time they get it, they're actually no, that's not what I was interested in. And additionally, you oftentimes had, basically your product owner was talking to every single team involved in the entire delivery pipeline. So basically that was actually for that person, they're talking to 4 different people. But then those 4 people are actually talking to other people, so you end up with a lot of different connections and actually discussions happening. Actually kind of just waste a lot of time just doing that communication. And so to solve that, they bring in a project manager who then actually talks to each individual, make sure everybody's kind of doing the right things, they're hitting the right phase, the right milestones. But in the end, each team doesn't know what the other one's doing. So then we kind of fast forward from the 80s, over to the 90s into the early 2000s. We kind of see actually, we need to be a bit more agile. We need to ship features faster to users, react more quickly when a new startup comes along, especially late 90s, had the internet boom, basically. E-commerce came in. Suddenly, you didn't actually need to invest all that time in infrastructure. And as a result, as we started to move faster and faster, bottlenecks started to pop up. And then eventually, those little silos, each team not really talking to each other, those slow down progress. And we started seeing that, oh, actually, we're not really building for users. We're building into timelines. They don't really consider the actual people involved in it. Or the organizational structure, it's basically still designed for waterfall, even though it's saying, hey, we're going to be agile. So you could say, yes, we're going to have shorter delivery timelines and work faster. But at the end of the day, when you go higher up, they still say, 6 months, we ship this feature. So around this time also, basically had the Agile manifestos. So then Scrum became the new way, kind of introduced the sort of development cycles, kind of work more on sequential milestones, treating basically the customer actually out properly as an artifact of the business, not just as a person who gets requirements. But it still remains very, very process heavy. A lot of documentation required for it. And your product owner is still very depressed, losing sleep, super stressed. Because yes, we have shorter cycles, but timelines keep slipping. We never actually hit those promised deadlines. So what actually happened is we kind of took this waterfall approach to what I call the waterfall Scrum. We just kind of combined a couple areas within the delivery process. We said we're doing Scrum. But then the deployment, things get shifted over a little bit, and the delivery is still sitting with the product owner. So you still have that big disconnect between the requirements to the delivery. So then we start talking about DevOps. So we say, okay, let's actually kind of combine the functions of developer and operations. Let's kind of think like, what's the big picture? How do we kind of reduce those handoffs and break down those silos? And to kind of increase the collaboration between teams, as opposed to, basically saying that's people talking to the teams. And, let's like really get that rapid feedback cycle going, So actually have developers start working with the services. Because hey, if we build automation, automation takes you to it creates more transparency because see what's actually happening because everybody's using the same process. And as a result, that increases the collaboration. But remember what I said, the organization doesn't really adapt to the new way of working. So what often happens, you have your system admin, you have a database admin, they're now doing DevOps. So now you have a DevOps team. Jump back. These are actually more the pillars of DevOps. It's a principle, it's a culture, it's a way of working together. So when you have your DevOps team working with your development team, you just have two silos. So how do you fix those silos? Well, you take your DevOps engineer and you put it in the development team. And you still have a silo. Because at the end of the day, the person who's actually handling the delivery process still sits with that DevOps engineer. It's essentially an operations engineer rebranded. So what ended up happening? That deployment cycle changed to DevOps. You have your sysadmin who knows how to write code. So why does everything still suck? I ask myself this question all the time still, and I've had a platform. So really what it came down to is, they adopted a lot of processes, but they didn't really actually think, like, how do we actually change the culture to work with it? Because your work culture, your company culture actually really is a big part of that. The easiest answer to figure out what kind of culture you have is what happens when things go sideways. Do people actually come together to work towards a solution? Do they try to figure out who caused it and get them to fix it? Does it suddenly become very top-down? Basically you have like the senior executives trying to figure out what's going on. They want to get it fixed immediately. Other challenge is always prioritizing the customer requirements over the feedback. So instead of actually talking to the customer regularly to kind of confirm what's happening, is this the right assumption? Klaus actually mentioned it really greatly. It was actually to measure at the very beginning and then talk to them. And also the right shifting the ownership. So actually moving sort of like the ownership of actual delivery of the product further and further down, saying like, okay, by the time we get to the end, we'll talk to the customer, they'll love it. And also, of course, that top-down focus. Basically saying we're going to deliver with fixed timelines because we want the revenue to come through. We know that if we deliver, by the beginning of June, that'll be time for the right season. So we have to ship by June. And from the bottom up, they're pushing for more flexibility. They want to have those shorter cycles. They want to be able to actually move faster, work in smaller cycles, work on smaller work units. But because you have all of this friction, no matter what process you actually adopt, everything still sucks. So, with that said, that rather cynical view of how things have kind of evolved and changed over time, I kind of want to jump back a little further. A few million years. Actually, a few billion years, actually. Talk about convergence itself. So, let's just look at this crab. It's a blue porcelain crab. It's very nice. And it has a very flat carapace, it kind of protects it. Has this like strong claw, for breaking things. It's very good at what it does. But the reality is this isn't actually a crab. What it is a crab-like creature. So you see over millions and millions of years, different creatures tend to evolve to adopt crab-like characteristics. So you have like a king crab, the porcelain crab, hermit crab, they're all called crabs. They have crab-like features, but none of them are actually crabs. And you see this all over in pop culture, comics even. The ultimate form is the crab. It's not actually that. Things tend to evolve in the crabs and de-evolve back and forth. We don't actually know why, to be clear. So I kind of think of it as, convergent evolution is a process where over time, similar features are basically, adopted by totally unrelated species. So let's kind of jump back to platforms. Now we have this little segue into crabs. So at the end of the day, it's basically, organizations, they want to change to deliver more value to their users or their customers. They want to ship faster, they want to get more feedback quicker, they understand what the customer needs, want to know how the market is changing. At the end of the day, they just want to deliver value. Or, to kind of connect it back to the evolution, in every product development process, there's a concept of sort of diverging on ideas and converging in a single one. So you always start with some sort of theory at the very beginning, or an assumption. But when you diverge, you kind of explore every single possibility as quickly as possible, or a very focused group of possibilities, until you figure out which one of those actually makes sense, narrow it down until you get to one that actually works. That is the nature of divergence and convergence. So let's also kind of look at how this works in developers. So oftentimes you have each dev team kind of starts out, and they pick what works best for them. So here we have two dev teams, Gemini and Capricorn. They use two different language stacks, different CI/CDs, which for them works great. But then eventually you get to the point where, because we're saying each team focuses on what actually works for them, they start focusing on we call it experimentation, which actually they're calling it innovation, so it's kind of this conflict of the innovation experimentation. Which one is it? And they sacrifice stability as a result. So like one team says, hey, we're using Azure with Scala. Another team says, hey, no, we're going to do it that way. We're going to like this better. Another one says, you know what, Kubernetes is awesome. We're going to use Kubernetes. So what happens? You end up with fragmentation. So you have challenges where now you're actually trying to hire more people, you're trying to grow those teams. And suddenly you discover you can't actually just say, like, we want to hire one engineer who knows Java. Actually, we need to hire an engineer who knows Java, Kotlin, they know Azure, AWS. They don't understand how to use Kubernetes. Suddenly you're actually hiring for actually 3 different roles in one role. You actually restrict the ability to innovate because they have to maintain all these different tech stacks. Now, I kind of went a bit high level here with language, platform, but this thing happens if you just look at libraries even, especially in front end. So you have the knowledge overhead. And as a result, you start sacrificing that stability I mentioned, so you can actually just kind of keep experimenting. Because there's this urge to always deliver value, deliver features as fast as possible. So we're going to grab the latest tech that promises the best value. And you end up overworking your engineers, and they lose sleep and unfortunately become the undead. But this also applies across organizations, outside of tech even. And so consider a large organization that has multiple software products, and they're always selling it to potential customers. So you end up having, Gemini has one unique sales channel, one product onboarding process. Other products are the same thing. It's all unique. So you have one customer comes along saying, I actually want to buy both of those. And suddenly they're dealing with 2 invoices, 2 onboarding processes, and behind the scenes, you could actually have one operations team has to handle the onboarding, and now they get 2 separate requests. And they don't understand the order of them, which one's more important, is there a dependency between them, and you create a lot of friction because there's a lot of these gaps in the entire process. So how do you kind of introduce standardization? So on the development side, we say, we're going to use this language. It's their standard. We're going to use Jenkins. They can now take that and build their solutions on top of it. We'll look on the product side, delivery side. We'll have one unified procurement process, a la carte. Customer can go in, they can pick and choose what they want. Behind the scenes, one onboarding notification. Much smoother process from delivery to procurement, sorry. So at the end of the day, when we're actually talking about a platform, we're actually talking about economies of speed. How do we actually take all the complicated, large moving parts that don't actually change very often and move it away from the dev teams that have to think about it, move it away from the product teams that have to think about it, or the business side. And on top of that was actually where we start building those services that actually can move faster, because all of those large, cumbersome areas aren't needing to be reinvented or thought about. So actually move much, much faster because you've invested in actually building out the scale to move quickly. So you think about it as, organizations, over time, they're going to establish a common platform to accelerate delivery, deliver more features, deliver value. Another way of thinking about it, unrelated organizations will eventually converge. Yes, there was a reason for the crabs. So at the end of the day, it's really, we look at all these different organizations, eventually they hit a point in either growth or maturity where they realize we actually need to kind of start creating some commonalities across development, across product, across sales. And that requires building a platform, actually somebody to actually maintain that platform and take care of it properly. Or, and you think about it, you need to come together and create Crab Voltron. I was going to make stickers, and I forgot to apologize. So, how do we succeed with platforms? Now, Klaus already talked quite a bit about it, which I'm going to kind of touch upon a little bit, so there'll be some overlap. There's always overlap within these talks. It's always a question of the angle. Mine is crabs. So, once again, defining a platform is really just creating something bigger than the sum of its parts. It's not just a bunch of tools you kind of shove together. It's actually how we interact with it. And it's really kind of making the users actually really building the right thing at the right time, the right way, as fast as possible. And also, a lot of the time, it's really what you call interfaces. So if anybody ever asks me, like, what do you call a platform? It's just interfaces. That's all it is at the end of the day. You're taking all this complicated crap behind the scenes, and you're creating a single interface that's easy for them to work with. However, it's important to know the difference between an abstraction and an illusion. An abstraction, the person can actually see the complexity behind it and appreciates the interface. They can also understand how to actually expand it. An illusion, this is a button. It'll give you a service. Well, I need to change the CPU. It doesn't matter. It's just a button. It'll give you what you want, I promise. That is an illusion. That actually creates friction over time because the customer says, like, I want to actually try to change what I want here. And you're telling them, like, no. This is our platform product. We know what you need. And the most important thing, and if you know Simon Sinek, you know the golden circle, is really kind of knowing the motivation behind building the platform. Because everybody can always say, like, oh, we know what we're going to build. We're going to build a platform. We know how we're going to build it. We're going to use Kubernetes, with basically we're going to have Datadog on top of it, create a unified interface with some abstractions behind the scenes. It makes it easy to actually deploy a service and get all the monitoring. That's your how. But then it's like, why? Why do we need a platform? Well, because we need to evolve. Okay, well, why do we need to evolve? The motivation is the most critical aspect. Because you can build it, but are they going to come? That's always a challenge. It's that go-to-market aspect. So if you kind of forget actually understanding the motivation behind building platforms, that's actually generally where things start to fall apart. And when you have that why answered, then people can actually start thriving within that platform. Because at the end of the day, your developer doesn't think about the platform, they think about the application they're working with. And the application is built on top of your platform. All the products and tools and processes actually go into that platform. And that's what it means to actually thrive within the platform, because the less the developer has to think about what's actually the platform, the easier it is for them to actually work. And then let's talk about some evolutionary dead ends, with the platform. So there's oftentimes, one of the first things we see introduces cognitive overload. We could come and say, you know what? We have been running at Azure for a very long time, but we don't really like how Microsoft licensing is, so we're going to build a new platform in AWS. But we're going to put the migration effort on the developer teams because they know their product the best. So you've built a platform on a totally different technology stack that the users don't actually know, so it creates cognitive overload. You didn't actually talk to the users at the very start to understand what it means to migrate. And you actually built the technology before it actually even needed, because they didn't actually need AWS. They're perfectly happy on Azure. And the last one, often at times I've actually seen, is when there's not really the understanding the motivation or the why, or how to actually build this enablement into your platform, is you create a service desk. So basically, you take your operations team, you rebrand them as a platform team. At the end of the day, they're getting support requests on, hey, how do I set up CI/CD into a repository? Hey, I ran into this error. Hey, how do I set up CloudWatch alarms? Why is this dashboard not working? You're kind of losing that enablement aspect. So this is like my little, I have a few little starter packs that I have for people. One, I call it farming. You're building a platform, go out there and see what people are building themselves. I guarantee you have a senior engineer out there who's built a crap load of tools and processes that people are using behind the scenes. When I joined an organization, they said the release management sucked. They're like, nobody knows how to do releases. So I started digging into it. I discovered they had 7 documents. Each one is maintained by a different person. And each document was actually used by different people. So literally, the first thing I did, I just unified that all together, and I sat down with each one of those people and actually kind of made sure that I had everything they thought was necessary. In a way, that was a platform product. Documentation is a product. Other aspect is always, think of the customers. I say customers because you have internal customers. Put them ahead of the process. Whatever process you're trying to build, think about what they actually need first, and prioritize those platform-centric solutions. And as Klaus said, think of the 80%. Not the power users or the most vocal. One of the challenges I had when I was doing an NES survey at an organization, we sent out a full broadcast, and we got positives for everything. And we got incredibly critical on the other side. So we had very polarized feedback. I dug into it. 80% of the responses were from senior or higher engineers. Next round, they did a randomized, looking actually at seniority to actually tackle all the entire breadth of experience levels. Much more valuable feedback there. So I actually got a stronger sampling by actually making sure we're scattered across experience levels and across the teams. So that's all the same. Many users or some users means actually talking to as many diverse experiences and backgrounds as possible to know that whatever you're building actually fits as many use cases as possible. The last one is also, think of the big picture first, because oftentimes, you start building a platform, you see all these little challenges here and there. I have a list in my little Obsidian notebook of different things that I've seen that I'm like, this can just wait. You want to start to zoom out as high as possible and start declaring platform standard where everybody's already using it. You're going to say, hey, we're using AWS. That is our platform standard. It's like we're using AWS. Great. That's what I like to hear. The language, operating system, start there, because once you enforce that as a standards, then you can start building on top of it. Okay, we're using Java as our language operating. Okay, let's actually look at how we use our test frameworks. Okay, now I see a bit of a diversity there, so let's start kind of like unifying that actually the proper framework to use going forward. Cloud provider, we're AWS. Okay, are we using EC2, ECS, AKS? Let's kind of start standardizing that a little bit. Operating system. How are we doing security patches? How are we doing updates? Okay, we're using Docker containers. All right, which is our base image? How do we maintain those base images? How do we do security updates? You start seeing, suddenly you start actually identifying how to build on top of that. Once you start very big, you start zooming in a bit over and over again. And that's actually where you start seeing less friction, because once you kind of communicate, hey, we're saying this is our first standard. We're going to go in a little bit. We'll go in, in. Because the whole time you're talking to your users, you have them involved in the process. And they're much more motivated to adopt these things. And also, look at those immediate pain points. My first thing was a release document. It seems very obvious to me. But that was literally like, I came the first week of talking to people, I was like, I hate release management. I never know what the steps to do. Sometimes I miss a button. Like, okay, let me just actually draft this up. As an opportunity, I also built a technical documentation site. That became the foundation of actually introducing more best practices. So that is where you zoom out and address the immediate pain points. And also, I think, enable innovation, because sometimes you keep hearing people saying, okay, platforms, they restrict innovation. I can't experiment. But the reality is you can. Because standards aren't actually restrictions. It's not telling you what not to do. It's sort of just giving you a direction forward and saying you can create as many diverse solutions as you want, as long as you kind of follow this golden path we set forth for you. And also, don't be the ivory tower. Don't say, no, 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 this is how we do it. And also, it's also, if you're an ivory tower, you start establishing standards without the users. So make sure you actually do it with them. Involve them in the feedback. And the other thing is like encourage that structured experimentation. Because oftentimes you'll see it's like, hey, we are using, Optimizely for our feature flagging. But we see these issues with it, and we want to kind of evaluate some alternatives. Like, okay, let's actually sit down together and actually map out what issues you're having and see how we can actually kind of evaluate alternatives there. That is how you enable that experimentation, because you're doing it together. It is not a, I don't know, we already have like Optimizely, we've already paid for it, we're not going to change from there. Or even though we're using GitLab, we have issues with GitLab CI, we really want to use GitHub. Like, how do we actually do that? That starts your proper evaluation to actually look at alternatives. It's also important to also consider, like, what use cases are you solving there? Is it just one very vocal person? Or does it turn out that everybody has this issue and it's not actually a silent issue, a silent challenge? And I also say this best practices over extensive docs. If you haven't read it, I encourage reading Docs for Developers. It's written by the Kubernetes documentation team. I literally have a book on my desk that I keep opening, and I think I mention it every 2 weeks to my teams or to my peers. Because the important thing is, create those best practices. You don't need to write extensive documentation covering the entire solution, the motivations, how to use it, and everything. Like, prioritize that procedural documentation of how to do specific processes with your tools, and some reference documentation. Give me some references for the API specification, some links to other external documentation. Because if I have those last two items, people are going to keep going back to it. Because they'll eventually forget the process, but they always know they can go back to this location to understand what it is. And even now, actually, you can feed that entire documentation repository directly into an LLM, and now they have a nice little chatbot to give them all the reports back, as opposed to relying on whatever ChatGPT or Gemini knows, or depending on having the correct MCPs in place to actually fetch the documentation from that vendor. Because at the end of the day, sometimes you'll actually say, hey, we're using AWS CDK, but we want you to use our constructs first. And if their developers are only using the CDK MCP, they're actually going to completely bypass using the proper constructs that have those best practices you want them to work with. And really, at the end of the day, success of a platform starts with a conversation. Like, it's that motivation of why you're doing it. So you have to talk to your users, listen to their feedback, and it's a collaborative process of building that platform. Because you didn't know you wanted it until suddenly you're building a platform. So make sure that you're actually talking to your users the whole time. At the end of the day, it's really about empowering the ownership. Or as the hot thing we say is, you build it, you run it. Yes, it is terrifying, it is scary. You have to touch production, but it's OK. That's what the platform's for. Thank you. You can also connect with me. I'm also hiring an engineer if you're interested. I hope that's fine for the organizers. Yeah. Anybody have any questions? I'm always happy to answer questions. Thank you. Yeah, this came out of a random idea. She loved the idea of bringing in crabs. It just came up last year during a conversation. It kind of sat with me, and then I got an offer to speak at a meetup in Berlin. So I just wrote this presentation, and next thing I know, I'm speaking here. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'll be around.